I'm Alicia Rowan, 39 years old, and I worked my way up from an ROTC scholarship kid to a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. For years, I did everything to make my mother proud, sent money home, called from deployments, even wore my uniform quietly in the back pew of her church. But when she told me God doesn't need soldiers and refused to pray for me before I left for war, something in me changed. Have you ever given everything to someone who couldn't see your worth? If you have, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened that Sunday when the priest stopped mid-sermon and saluted me, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being dismissed or disrespected, hit that like button and subscribe. What came next no one in that church was ready for. I grew up in a town where Sunday meant something. Not just church, though we had plenty of that, but a kind of collective pause, like the whole county agreed to stop moving for a few hours and pretend we all believed the same things. My mother, Evelyn, led the choir at St. Agnes Catholic Church. She had a voice that could make Ave Maria sound like both a prayer and a warning. My father died when I was 14. Heart attack in the garage, wrench still in his hand. After that, faith wasn't optional in our house, it was the architecture. My mother built her life around it and expected me to do the same. I tried. I really did. I sat through Mass every Sunday, went to youth group on Wednesdays, helped organize the church fundraisers. But while other girls were learning to arrange flowers for the altar, I was in the garage my father left behind, building model planes from balsa wood and glue. I'd hold them up to the light coming through the window and imagine them real. Imagine myself inside one, going somewhere that wasn't here. My mother would find me there, hands sticky with adhesive, and she'd get this look, not quite disappointment, more like confusion. Like I was a puzzle piece from a different box that somehow ended up in hers. "You should be with the other girls," she'd say. "I'm fine here," I'd reply. She'd leave without another word, and I'd hear her upstairs, praying the rosary. I applied for an ROTC scholarship my junior year of high school. Didn't tell her until after I'd been accepted. We were sitting at the kitchen table when I explained it, full ride to State University, commission as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force upon graduation, a path towards something I couldn't quite name yet but knew I wanted. She set down her coffee cup carefully, like it might shatter. "The military." "Yes, ma'am." "You want to be a soldier?" "An officer." "In the Air Force." She shook her head slowly. "I didn't raise you for that. You raised me to work hard and serve something bigger than myself," I said. "That's what this is. Service to God is bigger than yourself, Alicia. Not service to." She waved her hand vaguely, like she couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. I graduated from basic training 4 years later at 22, newly commissioned as a second lieutenant. My mother didn't come to the ceremony. I called her that evening from a payphone outside the base chapel, still wearing my service dress, the new rank insignia feeling strange and stiff on my shoulders. "I made it," I told her. "I'm officially an officer now." There was a long pause. Then she said, "God doesn't need soldiers, Alicia. He needs peacekeepers." I stood there in the cooling evening air, listening to the dial tone after she hung up, and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do with that. I sent letters home during my first assignments, training rotations in Texas, temporary duty in Florida, the regular movements of a junior officer learning her job. I sent part of my pay too, allotments deposited directly into her account, making sure the house was maintained, that she had what she needed. She never acknowledged the money. Instead, she'd mail prayer cards, St. Michael, St. Joan of Arc, St. Christopher, with no note attached, just my name and APO address written in her careful script. Father Brennan, the parish priest, would sometimes add a line to her letters. Brief addendums about parish activities, always signed in Christ's peace. He'd known me since I was a child, had presided at my father's funeral, had watched me grow up in those pews. His additions were polite but carried a weight, like he was gently correcting course on something he found slightly off track. The imbalance became normal. I gave effort, sent updates, called when I could. She gave scripture and silence. I told myself it was enough that I was trying, that eventually she'd see what I was building. My first deployment came when I was 24, 6 months in Qatar, supporting flight operations at Al Udeid Air Base. The work was demanding but straightforward: logistics coordination, personnel management, learning how to lead people in an environment where mistakes had weight. I came back different, not harder, exactly, but clearer about who I was becoming. I made captain at 28. The promotion ceremony was small, professional, held in a conference room at my home station. My mother didn't attend. I'd sent her the invitation 6 weeks in advance, called twice to remind her of the date, offered to pay for her flight. "I don't think that's my place," she said during our last conversation about it. "You're my mother. It's exactly your place. It's your world, Alicia. Not mine." So I stood there while my commanding officer pinned the new rank on my shoulders, and I smiled for the mandatory photos, and afterward I went back to my quarters and didn't call home. The phone conversations became shorter after that. Monthly check-ins that felt like reporting to a distant supervisor. She'd ask if I was eating well, if I was attending chapel services on base. I'd say yes to both, even though chapel attendance was sporadic at best. Then she'd quote something: "They shall beat their swords into plowshares," and I'd let the silence sit between us until one of us found a reason to end the call. I came home on leave that fall. 2 weeks of accumulated time off, and I spent it in the house I grew up in, sleeping in my old bedroom with its faded wallpaper and crucifix above the door. The first Sunday back, my mother insisted I attend Mass with her. "Of course," I said. I was planning on it. She looked at me then, really looked, taking in the way I carried myself now, the unconscious straightness of my posture. "You'll want to change first." "I was going to wear my uniform," I said. "Service dress. It's appropriate for sit in the back," she interrupted. "Please. I don't want to make a spectacle." I wore the uniform anyway. Sat in the back pew like she asked, stood when the congregation stood, knelt when they knelt. People I'd known my whole life glanced back at me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else, something that might have been disapproval or might have been discomfort. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. After Mass, while my mother talked with her friends near the parish hall, I heard the whispers. Not loud, but not quiet enough. "Military life changes people. Such a shame. She was such a sweet girl. I pray for her soul." Father Brennan found me by my car as I was leaving. He walked with that measured pace priests have, hands clasped behind his back. "Alicia," he said. "Good to see you home." "Father." "It must be strange," he continued, trying to reconcile faith and war. "I imagine that's a difficult balance." I looked at him for a long moment. "I don't think about it as war, Father. I think about it as service." He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, that says he's heard what I said but hasn't really listened. "Of course. We all serve in our own way." I drove back to the house alone, and I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. My mother's faith community would never see what I did as honorable. Not because they were cruel, but because their framework couldn't accommodate it. To them, I'd chosen something worldly over something sacred, and no amount of explaining would change that calculation. I stopped trying to make her understand after that visit. Stopped expecting acknowledgement. The silence became its own kind of relationship, clean, predictable, requiring nothing from either of us except the occasional proof of life. The deployment order came in spring. Afghanistan, 12 months, embedded with a joint task force running aviation logistics out of Bagram. My mother had always avoided asking about deployments directly, as if not naming them meant they weren't real. This time, I told her anyway. I drove home on a Friday, 3 weeks before Wheels Up. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, preparing dinner like it was any other visit. I sat at the table and watched her move through the familiar motions, cutting vegetables with precision, the knife clicking against the board in steady rhythm. "I'm deploying," I said. "Afghanistan. I leave next month." Her hands stilled. She didn't turn around. "For how long?" 12 months. Maybe longer." She resumed cutting, each slice deliberate. "I see." The silence stretched out between us, filling the kitchen like smoke. Finally, I said what I'd come to say, the thing I'd been turning over in my mind during the drive. "I'd like you to pray for me before I go." The knife stopped again. This time she did turn, and her face was composed in that way she had, the way that meant she'd already made her decision and nothing would change it. I don't pray for violence, Alicia. Something in my chest went cold. I'm not asking you to pray for violence. I'm asking you to pray for your daughter. It's the same thing, she said quietly. Where you're going, what you're doing, it's all connected. I won't ask God to bless that. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the linoleum. Then pray for me to come back human. She turned back to the counter. Didn't answer. I left the next morning before she woke up, and I didn't say goodbye. Bagram was moon dust and diesel fumes, a sprawling base carved into geography that didn't want us there. I ran a logistics cell coordinating helicopter support for forward operating bases, supplies, personnel transport, medevac rotations. The work was constant, the stakes always visible. Every mission brief carried weight because every flight carried people. I had 2 junior officers under my direct command. First Lieutenant Sarah Nunez, 25, from San Antonio, with a laugh that could cut through any level of tension. And Captain Eric Hayes, 29, a pilot who'd transitioned to operations and approached every problem like it was a puzzle he was personally offended by. Sarah used to joke that I was too serious, that I needed to remember how to smile. Ma'am, permission to speak freely? She'd say, grinning. Granted. You look like you're trying to solve world hunger every time you check a flight manifest. Just making sure nobody dies today, Nunez. See, that's exactly what I mean. Aim lower. Just make sure nobody dies in the next hour. Much more manageable. Eric would shake his head at these exchanges, but he'd be smiling too. Don't encourage her, Major. She's hard enough to manage as it is. It was a good team. We worked well together, understood each other's rhythms. That matters in a place like Bagram, where exhaustion is ambient and mistakes compound. For months into the deployment, on a Tuesday that started like any other, one of our Chinooks went down during a routine supply run to a firebase in Kunar province. Mechanical failure, the investigation would later determine. Bird fell out of the sky 3 minutes from landing zone. Sarah was on board, coordinating the cargo manifest. Eric was flying chase in the trail aircraft and watched it happen. They recovered the bodies 2 days later. I identified Sarah's remains, signed the paperwork, packed her personal effects. Then I wrote letters to her family explaining nothing that mattered, because nothing I wrote could matter enough. Eric stopped talking after that. Not entirely, but mostly. He flew his missions, filed his reports, and disappeared into himself. I wanted to reach him, pull him back, but I was disappearing too, just in a different direction, into work that never stopped, into 18-hour days where I didn't have to think about the fact that I'd sent Sarah on that flight. I wrote home once during that period. Brief, factual. Alive. Mission ongoing. My mother didn't respond. 3 weeks later, I was copying reports in the admin office when I overheard 2 airmen talking about a church service. Not the base chapel, something happening back home, being live-streamed for deployed personnel. Some vigil for peace, one of them said. My mom sent me the link. Said her church is doing it. I almost didn't ask. But something made me. Where's your mom's church? He told me. Different state, different denomination. But it got me thinking, so that night I used the satellite internet to search for St. Agnes, my mother's church. Found a bulletin posted on their website from 3 weeks prior. Special vigil for peace abroad scheduled for a Thursday evening. I clicked through to the archived photos. There was my mother in the 3rd row, hands folded in prayer. There was Father Brennan at the pulpit, arms raised in blessing. There was a banner reading, "Pray for all those serving far from home." Not one mention of my name. Not one specific prayer for her daughter. Just broad, generic intercession for peace, the kind that let her pray without actually praying for me, specifically, for what I was doing. I sat in front of that screen in a plywood office lit by fluorescent tubes, breathing in recycled air that smelled like dust and resignation, and something broke. Not dramatically. Just quietly, like a wire snapping deep inside machinery, the kind of break you don't notice until later when nothing works right. I closed the browser and went back to work. The rest of the deployment blurred. I kept my people alive, ran my operations, earned an end-of-tour medal that felt like an apology the Air Force was making for things it couldn't prevent. When my replacement arrived, I briefed her for 3 days straight, making sure she understood every detail, every nuance. Making sure nobody else would end up like Sarah. Eric found me the night before I flew out. We stood outside the operations tent under stars that looked nothing like home. "You okay, Major?" he asked. "I'm fine." That's not what I asked. I looked at him, this man who'd watched his friend fall from the sky and somehow kept flying anyway. "I don't think any of us are okay, Hayes. I think we're just functional." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Take care of yourself," I said. "You too, ma'am." I flew out the next morning and didn't look back. I came home to a promotion and silence. They'd pinned Major on me in country, a battlefield promotion approved while I was still running missions. At 33, I was 04, wearing rank that felt heavier than it should. The Air Force gave me 30 days of leave. I spent the first week sleeping, the second week processing, and by the third week I couldn't stay still anymore. I drove home, not to stay with my mother, but just to be near something that used to make sense. I checked into a motel off the interstate, one of those places with free coffee and televisions bolted to the furniture. Called my mother from the room, staring at wallpaper that was trying too hard to look cheerful. "I'm in town," I told her. "Thought you should know." Pause. "You're not staying here?" I thought the motel might be easier. Another pause, longer. "I see. I'm around for a couple weeks if you want to have dinner or something." "I'll check my calendar," she said, and I knew she wouldn't call back. I spent those weeks driving around town, watching it like a stranger. Nothing had really changed. Same streets, same buildings, same church spire visible from almost everywhere. But I'd changed enough that it all looked different now, like a photograph from someone else's life. The nights were harder. I'd lie in that motel bed and think about Sarah, about the letters I'd sent home that were never answered, about birthdays nobody called about and promotions nobody acknowledged. I thought about my mother organizing a vigil for peace while her daughter was in a combat zone, and I tried to find anger about it, but could only find exhaustion. I ran into Tom DeSantis at a coffee shop downtown. We'd gone to high school together, and he'd taken a different path to the same place, seminary instead of ROTC, chaplain corps instead of operations. He was a major now too, doing his residency at a base in Virginia. "Alicia Rowan," he said, grinning. "Heard you were back." We sat outside in the October sun, drinking coffee that was better than anything on base, trading stories that started with "remember when" and ended with laughter that felt like medicine. Eventually, the conversation turned serious the way it always does between people who've seen things. He asked how I was adjusting, and I gave him the standard answer about transition being a process. He wasn't buying it. "What's really going on?" So I told him. Not everything, but enough. About the deployment, the vigil, the years of prayers that were never quite for me. He listened without interrupting, the way good chaplains do. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circles. "Faith isn't supposed to erase duty," he finally said. "That's not how it works." Tell that to my mother. I mean it, though. People get confused about this. They think if you have faith, you can't do hard things. Can't make hard choices. But that's backwards. Faith is supposed to give you the strength to do the hard things and then live with them after. I looked at him. She thinks I'm doing something wrong. She thinks she's protecting her idea of what's right. That's different. Not from where I'm sitting. He smiled sadly. No, I guess it wouldn't be. We talked for another hour, and when we parted ways, something had shifted. Not solved, just shifted, like I'd been carrying something in the wrong position and finally adjusted the weight. I started thinking about what I actually wanted from all this. Not reconciliation, exactly. That felt too big, too unlikely. But maybe closure. Maybe just the ability to stand in the same room as my mother and not feel like I was constantly apologizing for existing. The idea came slowly over several days. I'd go to St. Agnes one more time. Not to make a scene, not to prove anything. Just to be present, in my uniform, as exactly who I was. And then I'd leave town and get on with my life. It felt like the right kind of ending. I almost didn't go through with it. Sunday morning, sitting in that motel room in my service dress blues, medals properly arranged, shoes shined until they reflected light. I looked at myself in the mirror and thought about how much easier it would be to just leave, skip the whole thing, drive back to base and pretend I'd found some kind of peace. But I'd spent 5 years making things easier for everyone else. I could handle 1 hour of being exactly who I was. St. Agnes looked the same as it always had, white clapboard siding, tall narrow windows, the kind of building that photographs well in snow. I arrived 15 minutes before Mass started, parked in the back lot where I used to park when I was young and bored and counting down the minutes until I could leave. The uniform drew attention immediately. People turning to look as I walked up the steps, conversations pausing mid-sentence. I caught fragments of whispers, saw recognition dawn on familiar faces. Nobody stopped me, though. They just watched. I slipped into a pew near the back. Not the very last row. That felt too much like hiding, but close enough that I wasn't making a statement just by existing. I knelt briefly, out of habit more than devotion, then sat and waited. My mother was in her usual spot, third row on the right, next to Mrs. Patterson, who'd been her friend for 30 years. She hadn't turned around yet, hadn't seen me. I watched the back of her head, her gray hair carefully arranged, her posture perfect, and tried to remember what it felt like to seek her approval. Couldn't quite reach it anymore. The organ started and everyone stood. Mass proceeded the way it always had, the procession, the readings, the responsorial psalm. Father Brennan moved through the rituals with practiced ease, his voice carrying that particular cadence priests develop, the one that makes everything sound both important and soothing. I went through the motions automatically, muscle memory from years of repetition. Stand, sit, kneel. The congregation moved like a single organism, everyone synchronized in their devotion. Father Brennan began his sermon about 20 minutes in. Something about humility before God, about pride being the first sin, about the importance of remembering our place in the divine order. His voice was gentle but firm, threading that line between correction and compassion. I wasn't really listening. I was thinking about Sarah, about the last conversation we'd had before that flight. She'd been excited because her sister was having a baby and she was going to be an aunt. First one in the family, she'd said. I'm already planning to spoil that kid rotten. I wondered if her sister had the baby yet. If it was a boy or a girl. If they'd told the child about Sarah, or if they'd wait until later, when loss could be explained. Father Brennan's voice cut through my thoughts. He'd stopped mid-sentence, gone quiet in a way that made people look up from their bulletins. I followed the direction of his gaze and realized he was looking directly at me. Recognition was immediate, I could see it in his face. He knew exactly who I was, probably knew my rank, maybe even knew where I'd been. Small towns keep track of their own, even the ones they're not sure they claim. He stepped back from the pulpit. The movement was slight but deliberate, carrying weight in its precision. Then he straightened his posture, brought his hand up, and saluted. The gesture was clean, proper, hand to forehead, fingers together, the way you're taught in basic. He held it for a beat, too, then spoke clearly into the silence. Ma'am, it's an honor. The congregation gasped. Not everyone at once, but in waves, sharp intakes of breath rippling through the pews like wind through wheat. Heads turned. My mother's hand went to her rosary, clutching it like an anchor. I stood without thinking, muscle memory taking over. Returned the salute the way I'd been trained, holding it until he dropped his hand. Then I sat back down, my heart hammering in my chest, very carefully not looking at my mother. Father Brennan returned to his sermon, but I don't think anyone was really listening anymore. The moment hung in the air like incense, like something physical that couldn't be taken back. The rest of Mass passed in a blur. I stood when I should stand, sat when I should sit, but I was disconnected from it, floating somewhere outside myself. When it finally ended, I stayed seated while people filed out, letting the crowd thin. My mother didn't come to me. I watched her leave with Mrs. Patterson, her movements stiff, her face carefully blank. Father Brennan caught my eye as he processed out, gave me a small nod. I nodded back. I sat there for 10 more minutes in the empty church, listening to the building settle, breathing in the smell of candle wax and old wood. Then I stood, smoothed my uniform, and walked out into the Sunday morning light. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be my responsibility. I'd shown up. I'd been present. That was enough. My mother didn't call that afternoon. Or that evening. I sat in the motel room watching television without sound, waiting for something I couldn't quite name. The phone stayed silent. The next day, around 3 in the afternoon, there was a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing there, purse clutched in both hands, looking smaller than I remembered. I opened the door. "Mom." "I didn't ask him to do that," she said immediately, defensively. "I didn't know he was going to. I wouldn't have wanted him to make a scene like that." I stepped back, letting her in. She perched on the edge of the bed, still holding her purse like a shield. I sat in the chair by the window. "He didn't salute you," I said quietly. "He saluted what you raised." She looked at me sharply. "That's not fair." "Maybe not. But it's true." Silence filled the space between us. Outside, traffic hummed past on the interstate, people going somewhere, always going somewhere. "Everyone's talking about it," she finally said. "Mrs. Patterson called 4 times yesterday. Father Brennan mentioned it might make the parish bulletin." "Is that what bothers you?" "That people are talking." "I'm bothered that my daughter thinks she needs to prove something by wearing a uniform to church." I wasn't proving anything. I was just being myself. She shook her head. "You used to be different." Before all this, I repeated. "You mean before I became someone you didn't plan for?" Her hands tightened on the purse. "I wanted you to be safe. To have a good life. A normal life." "I have a good life. It's just not the one you imagined." She stood abruptly. "I should go." I didn't stop her. She paused at the door, her back to me. "I don't know how to be proud of something I never wanted for you," she said softly. "I know," I replied. "But that's your problem to solve, not mine." She left without another word. I stayed in town for 3 more days. The story spread the way stories do in small places, talked about at the grocery store, mentioned over coffee, debated in living rooms. I heard secondhand through Tom that opinions were mixed. Some people thought Father Brennan had done something beautiful. Others thought it was inappropriate, too political, too worldly. The local paper ran a small item on the bottom of page 3, Major Alicia Rowan honored at St. Agnes Church. 30 words summarizing a moment that couldn't really be summarized. For once, when people talked about Evelyn Rowan's daughter, they didn't do it with pity or concern. They did it with a kind of careful respect, the tone people use when they're not quite sure what to think but know they should think something. I wondered how that felt for my mother, having her community finally see what she'd spent years trying to minimize. I wondered if it changed anything for her, or if it just made the gap between us more visible. I drove back to base on a Thursday, windows down, radio playing something forgettable. I didn't call to say goodbye. Didn't promise to visit again soon. Just left, the same way I'd left before, except this time I wasn't carrying the weight of hoping she'd change. Back at base, I threw myself into work. I'd been assigned to a training squadron, teaching junior officers logistics coordination and operational planning. The work was satisfying in a way the deployment hadn't been, building things instead of maintaining them, teaching people instead of just commanding them. I started mentoring young lieutenants who reminded me of Sarah. I taught them to be thorough, to think 3 steps ahead, to care about the details because details kept people alive. I never told them about Afghanistan directly, but they could sense it somehow, the way students always know when teachers are speaking from experience that costs something. One of them, a sharp second lieutenant named Maria Torres, asked me once why I was so insistent on triple-checking maintenance schedules. "Because helicopters fall out of the sky," I said. "And when they do, someone has to write the letters." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded and went back to her checklist without another question. I was good at the work. Good at creating systems, at training leaders, at building competence in people who'd one day be responsible for others. It felt like the right use of everything I'd learned, including the losses. The months turned over. Fall became winter, became spring. I ran 5 miles every morning before dawn, kept my quarters military precise, spent evenings reading in the base library. I dated occasionally, a fellow major from the intelligence wing, a civilian contractor who worked in IT, but nothing stuck. I wasn't broken, exactly. Just selective about who I let into the space I'd carved out for myself. My mother and I settled into a new pattern. Christmas cards, brief phone calls on birthdays, the minimum maintenance required to say we were still in contact. The conversations were polite, surface level, and nobody pushed for more. I told myself I was fine with it. Mostly I was. Then, in July, my mother had a stroke. Minor, the doctors said, but strokes are never really minor. Mrs. Patterson called me at 0600 on a Tuesday, her voice shaking. "Your mother's in the hospital. You should come." I took emergency leave and drove through the night, arriving at the regional medical center just after dawn. Found my mother in a semi-private room, looking diminished against white sheets, and 4 taped to her hand. She was awake, watching the door like she'd been waiting. "Alicia," she said. Her voice was slightly slurred, but present. "Hey, Mom." We looked at each other across the sanitized space, all the years sitting between us like furniture we had to navigate around. "They say I'm fine," she continued. "Just need to rest. Take some medication." "That's good. You didn't have to come." "Yeah," I said. I did. I stayed for a week, handling the logistics my mother couldn't manage, talking to doctors, arranging home care, coordinating with her insurance, organizing her medications. The practical things I was good at, the things that didn't require us to address anything deeper. Mrs. Patterson and the church ladies brought food, enough casseroles to feed a small army. They thanked me for coming, told me how good it was that I could be here, treating me with a careful courtesy that felt new. Father Brennan visited on the 3rd day. He sat with my mother for a while, then found me in the waiting room where I was working through paperwork. "She's lucky to have you," he said. She'd probably debate that. He smiled slightly. Maybe, but I wouldn't. On the 5th day, my mother started asking questions. Small ones at first, almost cautious. "What's your daily routine like? Do you still run every morning? What do you do when you're not working?" Then, while I was helping her with dinner, she asked, "What was it like out there?" I looked at her, trying to gauge how much truth she actually wanted. "Which part?" "Any of it." So I told her. Not about combat or danger, she didn't need those details. But about camaraderie, about the people I'd served with. About reconstruction projects and medical convoys. About a school we'd helped build in a village outside Bagram, and how the children had lined up to shake our hands. She listened without interrupting, her food growing cold while I talked. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I never thought about that part," she finally said. "The building. I only thought about the destroying." I offered. "The conflict," she corrected. "But yes, it's both," I said. "Most things are." Father Brennan came by later that week, after I'd returned my mother home and was preparing to head back to base. He asked to speak with me privately, and we sat on my mother's back porch in the evening heat. "I wanted to explain," he said. "About that Sunday." "You don't have to." "I do, actually." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I've known your mother for 20 years. Watched her struggle with your choices, watched her try to reconcile her faith with her fear. And we realized, the church, that we'd failed her. And you." I didn't say anything. "We made her think she had to choose between her beliefs and her daughter. That's not what faith is supposed to do. So when I saw you there, in that uniform, having served the way you have." He paused. "I thought maybe God did need one soldier after all. Maybe he needed yours." He stood to leave, then stopped. I told her that, Told her maybe she'd been wrong about what God needed. What did she say? "She's thinking about it." A few days after I got back to base, a letter arrived. My mother's handwriting, careful and deliberate on the envelope. Inside was a single page. "Alicia, I'm not good at this. I never have been. But I want you to know I'm trying. I don't understand everything you do, and I probably never will. But I'm starting to see that maybe I don't have to understand it to be proud of it. Thank you for coming when I needed you. I know I haven't always been there when you needed me. I'm sorry for that. Love, Mom." I read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in my desk drawer. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And after 5 years of nothing, something felt like a lot. We started talking more after that. Real conversations, not just status updates. She'd ask about my work, and I'd tell her what I could. I'd ask about the church, and she'd share gossip about people I barely remembered. We were learning to be in each other's lives again, awkwardly, incrementally, like people who'd forgotten how to speak the same language and had to relearn it word by word. It wasn't perfect. We still disagreed about things, still had moments of friction where old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But there was effort now on both sides, and effort counted for something. 3 years later, I pinned Lieutenant Colonel. Oh, 5, command of a logistics wing, responsibility for hundreds of personnel and millions of dollars in equipment. The ceremony was formal, held in a hangar at my new duty station, attended by fellow officers and senior enlisted leadership. My mother came. Mrs. Patterson drove her, and they sat in folding chairs near the back, my mother in a wheelchair now, not because she couldn't walk, but because distances were harder these days. She wore a nice dress and her silver cross, the one my father had given her for their 20th anniversary. I didn't expect her to stay for the whole thing. It was long, bureaucratic, full of military formality that I knew she found alienating. But she stayed, watched as my new commander pinned the rank on my shoulders, listened to the citations being read, sat through the reception afterward where officers and their families mingled over coffee and cookies that tasted like cardboard. When she was ready to leave, I walked her out to Mrs. Patterson's car. The afternoon sun was bright, almost aggressive, making everything look overexposed. "Thank you for coming," I said. She looked up at me from the wheelchair and her eyes were wet. "I should have come before. To all of them. You're here now. That's what matters." "I'm proud of you," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. I don't say that enough. But I am. I knelt down next to the wheelchair, not caring that I was getting my dress uniform dirty. "I know, Mom." She reached out and touched the new rank on my shoulder, her fingers light and careful. "Your father would be proud too." "Yeah," I said. "I think he would." Mrs. Patterson helped her into the car, and I watched them drive away, my mother's hand raised in a small wave through the rear window. That night, alone in my quarters, I took off the uniform and found the silver cross inside, my mother's cross, the one she'd given me that morning with a note that read, "Wear it if you want. Or don't. Either way, know I'm with you." I'd tucked it inside my jacket, against my heart, and worn it through the entire ceremony. I held it now in the lamplight, feeling the weight of it, the years of prayers it represented. I thought about putting it away, saving it for special occasions. Then I threaded it onto the chain I wore with my dog tags and decided I'd just wear it. Every day. Not as a statement, just as a fact. My mother died 4 years later, peacefully in her sleep. She'd made it to 73, which the doctors said was good considering the stroke and the heart issues that followed. I was stationed overseas when I got the call, and I flew back for the funeral, arriving just in time to help organize the service. Father Brennan officiated. The church was full. 20 years of choir leading and church committee membership meant she'd built a community that showed up when it mattered. I sat in the front pew in my service dress, the silver cross visible at my collar, and listened to people share memories of a woman who'd been more complicated than any eulogy could capture. After the service, while cleaning out her house, I found a letter tucked inside her Bible. My name on the envelope, the paper slightly yellowed. I opened it standing in her bedroom, surrounded by boxes of things that would need to be sorted or donated or thrown away. For my soldier daughter, it read, "I'm writing this while you're deployed, though I probably won't send it. I want you to know I prayed for you. Every single day. Every deployment, every mission, every time you flew somewhere I couldn't follow. I just couldn't say the prayers out loud, couldn't make them public, because I was afraid. Afraid that acknowledging what you were doing meant accepting I might lose you. So I prayed silently, in the dark, in the early mornings before anyone else was awake. I prayed God would guard you better than I ever did. I prayed you'd forgive me for not being braver. I hope someday you understand, it was never that I wasn't proud. It was that I was terrified. And fear made me small. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things. But I'm not sorry you became who you are. I'm only sorry it took me so long to say so. Love always, Mom." I stood there for a long time, holding the letter, crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry in years. Not sad tears, exactly. Just tears for time that couldn't be recovered, for words that came too late and exactly on time, for a relationship that had been broken and rebuilt into something different but real. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket, then went back to sorting through my mother's life. A month after the funeral, I attended chapel services on base. Not something I did regularly, but that morning it felt right. The chaplain was new, young, earnest in the way junior officers are before the job weathers them. His sermon was about service and sacrifice, familiar themes that usually rolled off me without landing. But sitting there in the hard wooden pew, wearing my uniform with my mother's cross underneath, I found myself actually listening. He talked about how service takes many forms. How sometimes the hardest service is learning to accept love from people who show it imperfectly. How forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing, it's about choosing to carry something different forward. After the service, I stayed seated while others filed out. The chaplain noticed, approached carefully. "Anything I can help with, Colonel?" I looked up at him, this kid who was probably 26, probably still figuring out how to minister to people who'd seen more than he had. "No," I said. "I think I'm good." He nodded and moved on, and I sat there a while longer, thinking about my mother, about faith, about the complicated ways people love each other when they don't know how. I thought about Sarah, about the letters I'd written to families, about all the people I'd served with who carried their own complicated relationships home. I thought about Father Brennan's salute, about my mother's silent prayers, about the years of distance that had somehow, eventually, become a different kind of closeness. And I thought about what I'd tell my younger self, if I could, about all of this. About whether the pain of that distance was worth it, whether the service mattered enough to justify the cost to relationships that couldn't stretch to accommodate it. I still don't know the answer to that. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe it's just life, messy, complicated, full of choices that don't resolve cleanly. But sitting there in that chapel, I realized something I hadn't quite understood before. My mother was right and wrong at the same time. God probably doesn't need soldiers. But soldiers need something bigger than themselves to serve, and sometimes they need faith to forgive the people who can't understand why. I stood up, straightened my uniform, and walked out into the morning light. I had a wing to command, junior officers to mentor, a job that mattered and people depending on me to do it well. And somewhere, I hoped, my mother was at peace. Maybe even proud. Definitely no longer afraid. I touched the cross at my collar, feeling the familiar shape of it, and headed back to work. The story doesn't really end. It just continues, the way life does, in moments that accumulate into years, into a career, into a life. I made full colonel eventually, '06, and stayed in until mandatory retirement at 30 years of service. I never married, never had children, built my family instead from the people I served with and the junior officers I mentored who went on to do good work in their own right. I kept my mother's letter, kept the cross, kept the memory of Father Brennan's salute and what it meant to be seen, finally, for exactly who I was. And I learned that faith and duty don't have to be in conflict. That sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is show up in uniform, stand in your truth, and let other people figure out how to meet you there. My mother did eventually, in her own way, on her own timeline. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. 10 years after my mother's funeral, I was 57 years old and 3 years into retirement. The transition out of the Air Force had been harder than I expected, not because I missed the work exactly, but because I missed the structure, the sense of clear purpose that came with wearing the uniform every day. Civilian life was softer around the edges, more ambiguous, full of choices that didn't come with mission briefs or clear objectives. I'd settled in Colorado Springs, close enough to Peterson Space Force Base that I could consult occasionally, far enough away that I wasn't living in the past. I bought a small house with a view of the mountains, adopted a dog, a German Shepherd mix named Charlie who'd washed out of military working dog training for being too friendly, and started teaching leadership courses at the local community college. It wasn't the Air Force, but it was something. The students were different than the young officers I'd mentored. More varied, more uncertain about their paths. Some were veterans using their GI Bill benefits, sitting in the front row with notebooks already organized and questions that cut straight to practical application. Others were kids fresh out of high school, still figuring out how to show up on time, let alone how to lead. I liked the mix. Liked the challenge of reaching people who hadn't been pre-selected for aptitude or attitude. One of my students that fall semester was a young woman named Rebecca Chen. 23, Air Force veteran, medically retired after a training accident left her with a permanent limp and a discharge she clearly hadn't wanted. She sat in the back corner and took notes with an intensity that felt familiar, like she was trying to save something by writing it all down. After class one day, she lingered while the others filed out. "Colonel Rowan?" "Just Alicia now," I said. "I don't make people call me by rank anymore." She smiled slightly. "That's going to take some getting used to." "Ma'am, what can I do for you, Rebecca?" She shifted her weight, favoring her good leg. I wanted to ask, how did you handle it? The transition out. Everyone talks about how hard it is, but nobody really explains what that means. I sat on the edge of my desk, considering the question. It means waking up and not knowing what your day is supposed to look like. It means realizing that the thing you built your identity around isn't there anymore, and you have to figure out who you are without it. That sounds terrible. It is. For a while. Then you start building something new, and it gets easier. What if you don't know what to build? I looked at her, this kid who'd had her path cut short, who was trying to figure out what came after the thing she'd wanted most was taken away. Then you try things until something sticks. You give yourself permission to not have it figured out yet. She nodded slowly, processing. Did you ever regret it? The service? No, I said without hesitation. I regretted things that happened during it. People I lost, mistakes I made. But the service itself? Never. Even though it cost you things? Especially because it cost me things. That's how you know it mattered. She left looking thoughtful, and I stayed late grading papers, thinking about costs and what they buy you, if you're lucky. I'd kept in touch with some people from my years in uniform. Tom DeSantis, who'd made full colonel in the chaplain corps before retiring to teach seminary. Eric Hayes, who'd left active duty after 20 years and was flying commercial now, still processing what happened in Afghanistan in his own way. A handful of former subordinates who checked in occasionally, sharing promotions or assignments or just saying hello. And I'd maintained a relationship with St. Agnes Church, strange as that felt sometimes. After my mother died, Father Brennan had asked if I'd be willing to speak to the youth group about service and vocation. I'd said no the first time, yes the second time, and ended up doing it annually for 3 years before I moved to Colorado. The kids had been skeptical at first. Military recruiting talks disguised as faith discussions had made them wary, but I wasn't there to recruit. I was there to talk about finding purpose and living with hard choices, and somehow that resonated. Father Brennan had retired himself 5 years back, replaced by a younger priest named Father Michael who'd served as a Navy chaplain before joining the diocese. We'd spoken on the phone a few times, trading stories about the overlap between military service and religious life, about the strange ways faith shows up in foxholes and flight lines. In October, he called with an unusual request. "Alicia, I'm organizing something for Veterans Day," he said. "A special service honoring parishioners who've served. I was hoping you'd be willing to come back, maybe say a few words." I was immediately skeptical. "I haven't lived there in a decade, Father. Wouldn't you rather have someone local?" "Local would be easier," he admitted. "But it wouldn't be right. Your mother was part of this parish for 30 years. You're part of our story, whether you live here or not. And honestly, I think people need to hear from you." "Why?" "Because the town is changing. We've got more military families now, Peterson Air Force Base expansions, Fort Riley personnel rotating through. And the older parishioners who remember your story, who remember what Father Brennan did that Sunday, they tell it to the newer families like it's parish legend. But legends get distorted. I'd rather have the real person there, telling the real story." I thought about it for a long moment. "I'm not a legend, Father." "No," he agreed. "You're better. You're real." So I agreed, and 3 weeks later I was driving back to the town I'd grown up in, watching familiar landscape roll past the windows. Charlie sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. I'd thought about leaving him with a neighbor, but the trip felt too long to do alone. The town had changed and hadn't. New developments on the edges, a Walmart where there used to be farmland, but the core remained the same. Same main street, same church spire, same sense that time moved differently here than in other places. I checked into a hotel. The motel I'd stayed at a decade ago had been torn down and replaced with a chain property that looked like every other chain property in America. Mrs. Patterson had offered to let me stay with her, but I'd declined. I wanted the option of retreat if things got overwhelming. The service was scheduled for Sunday at 1100 hours. Father Michael had asked me to arrive early, meet with some of the other veterans who'd be attending, coordinate the program. I showed up at 0930 in dress slacks and a blazer, my service medals pinned to the lapel, a compromise between civilian and military that felt appropriate. The church basement was set up like a community meeting, folding tables arranged in a square, coffee brewing in the corner. About 20 people were there, ranging in age from mid-20s to late 70s. Some in uniform, others in civilian clothes. All of them carrying the particular bearing that military service stamps into your posture, the way you hold yourself even after you've taken off the rank. Father Michael introduced me to the group. There were a few faces I recognized: Tommy Reeves, who'd been 2 grades behind me in school and done 20 years in the Army, Sarah Kim, who'd joined the Navy as a hospital corpsman and come back after her service to work at the regional medical center. But most were strangers, people who'd moved here after I'd left, who knew me only as a name if they knew me at all. We spent an hour going over the service structure. Father Michael wanted it to feel reverent but not performative, meaningful but not heavy. Each branch would be acknowledged, names of deceased veterans from the parish would be read, and I'd been asked to give a brief reflection, 5 minutes, nothing formal, just speak from the heart, he'd said. I'd prepared some remarks, written them out on index cards the night before. But sitting there in that church basement, listening to these other veterans share their own stories of service and return, I realized my prepared remarks weren't going to work. They were too polished, too safe. This group needed something real. "Can I ask you all something?" I said during a break in the planning. They looked at me with various degrees of curiosity. "How many of you came home to communities that didn't really understand what you'd done?" I asked. "Who tried to be supportive but couldn't quite get there?" Almost every hand went up. "How many of you had family members who struggled with your service? Who loved you but couldn't reconcile that love with what you were doing?" More than half the hands stayed up. "Yeah," I said. "Me too." The conversation shifted after that, became less about logistics and more about truth. Tommy Reeves talked about his father, a Vietnam vet who'd never talked about his service and couldn't understand why Tommy would volunteer for something that had broken him. Sarah Kim talked about her mother, a Korean immigrant who'd fled war and couldn't comprehend why her daughter would choose to go toward it. An older man named Bill Crawford, Air Force retired, talked about his wife who'd supported his career but resented every deployment, every missed birthday and anniversary, until the resentment calcified into something neither of them could break through. They'd divorced 3 years after his retirement. "I don't blame her," Bill said quietly. "I chose the service. She just chose me and got the service as part of the package." The stories accumulated, each one slightly different but fundamentally similar, people trying to bridge gaps between the life they'd chosen and the people who loved them, sometimes successfully, often not. I told them about my mother. The whole story this time, not the edited version. The years of silence, the vigil that didn't name me, the stroke that started conversations we should have had years earlier. The letter I found after she died. "The thing I learned," I said, "is that people love us the best way they know how. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it isn't. And we have to make peace with the gap either way." A younger woman, Army National Guard, raised her hand tentatively. "Did you ever get angry about it? The way your mother treated you?" "Yes," I said. "Absolutely. I was furious for years. But anger is exhausting, and eventually I had to choose between being right and having some kind of relationship. I chose the relationship. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that mattered more in the end." Father Michael had been listening quietly from the corner. "That's what you should talk about today," he said. "Not the prepared remarks. This isn't exactly inspirational, Father." "No," he agreed. "It's better. It's true. The church filled steadily as 1100 hours approached. I sat in a pew near the front with the other veterans, watching families arrive. The demographics had definitely changed. More young families, more diversity, more people in their 20s and 30s than I remembered. But there were familiar faces too, older now, moving more slowly, but present. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her daughter, spotted me, and made her way over with the careful steps of someone whose bones don't cooperate like they used to. She hugged me tightly. "Your mother would be proud you came back," she said. "I'm not sure about that," I replied. "I am." She told me once, near the end, she said she wished she'd been braver earlier. That she'd wasted too much time being afraid. She told me that too. In the letter. Mrs. Patterson nodded. "Good. I'm glad you know." The service began with a procession of veterans carrying flags representing each branch of service. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, Space Force, the newest addition, which still felt strange to see represented. We stood as they processed in, and I felt something loosen in my chest, some tension I'd been carrying without realizing it. Father Michael welcomed everyone, spoke briefly about the meaning of service and sacrifice, about the community's responsibility to honor those who serve. Then he invited me to the lectern. I left my index cards in the pew and walked up without them. The congregation was quiet, attentive. I saw young faces and old faces, veterans and civilians, people who knew my story and people who didn't. I took a breath and began. "I grew up in this church," I said. Sat in these pews every Sunday, sang in that choir loft, went a youth group in the basement where we just had our planning meeting. My mother led the choir for 20 years. Some of you probably remember her, Evelyn Rowan. She had strong opinions about hymn selection and perfect pitch. A few people smiled, nodding. When I joined the Air Force, my mother didn't understand it. She was a woman of deep faith, and in her mind, faith and military service were incompatible. She thought God needed peacekeepers, not soldiers. She told me that the day I commissioned, and she meant it. I paused, gathering the threads of what I wanted to say. For years, we barely spoke. I'd send letters, she'd send prayer cards. I'd call, she'd quote scripture. I'd come home on leave, and she'd ask me to sit in the back of the church in uniform because she didn't want to make a spectacle. It hurt. It hurt for a long time. The church was completely silent now. Then, about 15 years ago, I came back after a deployment. I'd lost people under my command. I was carrying grief and anger and exhaustion, and I decided to attend Mass one last time before leaving town again. I wore my uniform, not to make a point, just because it was who I was. And Father Brennan, who's retired now, who some of you remember, he stopped mid-sermon and saluted me. He said, "Ma'am, it's an honor." I saw recognition on several faces, people who'd been there or who'd heard the story. That moment changed everything. Not immediately, change is slower than that. But it started something. It started a conversation between my mother and me, awkward and imperfect, but real. She started asking questions. I started answering honestly. And slowly, over years, we built something new. I gripped the edges of the lectern. She died 4 years after that service. We had 4 years of actual relationship, after almost a decade of distance. 4 years isn't a lot. But it was enough for me to understand that she'd been praying for me all along, just silently, because she was afraid. Afraid of losing me, afraid of condoning something she didn't understand, afraid of being wrong. I looked out at the congregation, at the veterans sitting in their pews, at the families beside them. I tell you this because I think a lot of us carry versions of this story. We serve, and the people who love us struggle with that service. They worry. They disagree with our choices. They can't understand why we'd volunteer for something dangerous. And sometimes that creates distance that feels impossible to cross. I took a breath. But here's what I learned, and what I want to share with you today. Service is complicated, and so is love. People love us imperfectly because people are imperfect. And our job, if we want relationships that survive our service, is to make space for that imperfection. To understand that fear looks like judgment sometimes, that love looks like distance sometimes, and that the gap between what we do and what our families understand doesn't have to be permanent. I saw heads nodding, a few people wiping their eyes. My mother never fully understood what I did in the Air Force. She never stopped wishing I'd chosen differently. But she learned to be proud anyway, and I learned to accept that her pride didn't have to look like I'd imagined it would. We met each other halfway, and that was enough. I paused, finding my closing thought. So today, as we honor service, I want to also honor the families who struggle with that service. The parents who pray silently because they're afraid. The spouses who resent the absences, but stay anyway. The children who grow up not quite understanding why their mom or dad keeps leaving. They serve too, in their way. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is forgive them for not serving perfectly. I stepped back from the lectern. Thank you. The congregation was quiet for a moment, then someone started clapping, slow at first, then building. I returned to my pew, feeling exposed and exhausted and somehow lighter. The rest of the service passed in a blur. The reading of names deceased veterans from the parish, including my father's name, which I hadn't expected and which hit harder than I was prepared for. The hymns, the prayers, the benediction. When it ended, people came up to me in waves. Veterans wanting to share their own stories of complicated homecomings. Spouses thanking me for acknowledging their struggle. Young service members telling me they needed to hear that it was okay to have complicated relationships with the people who love them. One woman, maybe 40, with 2 kids in tow, gripped my hand tightly. My husband deployed 6 times, she said. I supported him every time, but I also resented him every time. I've felt guilty about that for years. You shouldn't, I told her. Resentment and support can exist at the same time. You're allowed to feel both. She started crying, and I hugged her while her kids looked on with the patient confusion of children who've seen their mother cry before. I stayed for the reception in the parish hall, drinking bad coffee and eating cookies that tasted exactly like the cookies from my youth. People cycled through, and I talked until my voice started to give out, until Father Michael finally rescued me and suggested I probably needed a break. That was exactly what we needed, he said as we stood in a quiet corner. Thank you. I just told the truth. That's what made it right. That evening, I drove out to the cemetery where my mother was buried. I hadn't visited since the funeral. Distance and life had made it impractical, and I wasn't someone who found much comfort in graves. But I was here now, and it felt right to go. Her headstone was simple, exactly what she would have wanted. Just her name, her dates, and a line from scripture. Well done, good and faithful servant. I stood there as the sun set, painting the sky in colors that looked fake, too saturated to be real. Charlie sat beside me, leaning against my leg, patient in the way dogs are when they know you need them to be. Hey, Mom, I said quietly. I came back. Spoke at the church today. Told them about us, about how hard it was, and how we figured it out anyway. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the smell of October, dry leaves and cold earth. I think you'd have approved. Or maybe you'd have been embarrassed that I aired our complications in public. Hard to say. But Father Michael thought it helped people, so I'm choosing to believe it was the right thing to do. I knelt down, touched the grass in front of her stone. I miss you. Not every day, life's too busy for that. But in moments. When I'm teaching and a student asks a question that sounds like something you'd ask. When I hear Ave Maria and remember you singing it. When I make decisions and wonder what you'd think of them. Charlie nuzzled my hand, and I scratched his ears absently. I'm doing okay. Better than okay, actually. I built a life after the Air Force, and it's good. Different than I expected, but good. I wish you could see it. Wish you could meet Charlie, see my house, sit in on one of my classes, and tell me afterward that I'm too hard on the students or not hard enough. I stood up, my knees protesting after too long kneeling. Anyway, I love you. I forgive you for the things you think you need forgiveness for. And I hope, wherever you are, you know that it all worked out. Not perfectly, but well enough. I walked back to the car as the last light faded from the sky, Charlie trotting beside me, and I felt something settle, some final piece of peace clicking into place. The next morning, before driving back to Colorado, I stopped at a local diner for breakfast. It was the same diner that had been there when I was a kid, updated but fundamentally unchanged. I ordered coffee and eggs and sat in a booth by the window, watching the town wake up. A man approached my table as I was finishing. Mid-60s, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, moving with the careful gait of someone whose body had been used hard and paid the price. "You're Alicia Rowan," he said. "I am. I was at the service yesterday. Wanted to thank you for what you said." "You're welcome. Please, sit if you'd like." He sat across from me, ordered coffee when the waitress came by. We talked for 20 minutes, about his service in Vietnam, about the welcome he didn't get when he came home, about the decades it took him to make peace with what he'd done and who he'd been. "I didn't talk about it for 40 years, he said. "Came home, got a job, raised kids, never mentioned the war. Then my grandson joined the army, and suddenly I couldn't stay quiet anymore. He needed to know it was normal, what he'd be feeling. The way it changes you." Did it help? Him knowing? I think so. At least he knows he can talk to me. That I'll understand the parts his parents can't. We exchanged email addresses before parting ways, promised to stay in touch. I didn't know if we would. Those kinds of promises are easy to make and hard to keep, but the conversation mattered regardless. The drive back to Colorado took most of the day. I stopped halfway for lunch and to let Charlie stretch his legs, then pushed through the rest of the distance as afternoon turned to evening. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was exhausted in that particular way that comes from emotional expenditure rather than physical effort. My house felt exactly right when I walked in, small, quiet, mine. I fed Charlie, made myself dinner, and sat on my back deck watching the mountains turn purple in the twilight. My phone buzzed with messages, Tom checking in, a few students from the class asking questions about the upcoming midterm, Rebecca Chen asking if I'd be willing to grab coffee sometime to talk more about transition. I answered them all, then set the phone aside and just sat. 10 years out of uniform, and I was finally comfortable in my own skin. Not because I'd left the service behind, you never really leave it behind, but because I'd figured out how to integrate who I'd been with who I was becoming. The military had shaped me, my mother had shaped me, loss and love and hard choices had shaped me. And somewhere in all that shaping, I'd become someone I could live with. Someone I might even be proud of if pride wasn't such a complicated thing for people like me to feel. I thought about the veterans I'd met yesterday, about the students I'd teach tomorrow, about all the people still figuring out how to bridge the gap between service and everything that comes after. I thought about my mother's letter, about Father Brennan's salute, about Sarah Nunez's laugh and Eric Hayes' silence, and all the moments that had built the architecture of my life. And I thought about what I'd tell my younger self if I could reach back across the decades, what wisdom I'd offer to that 22-year-old second lieutenant who'd just taken her first oath and couldn't see the road ahead. I'd tell her it's going to be harder than you think. People you love will hurt you, and you'll hurt them back, and sometimes there won't be clean resolution to that hurt. You'll lose people who matter, and you'll carry that loss in ways that change your shape. But I'd also tell her it's worth it. The service, the sacrifice, the complicated relationships, and difficult choices, it's all worth it. Not because it leads to some perfect ending, but because it leads to a life that means something. To students you'll mentor and people you'll save, and moments where you stand exactly in your truth and let the world decide how to meet you there. I'd tell her to be patient with her mother, but also to be strong enough to exist without her mother's approval. To understand that you can love someone and not need them to understand you. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is become yourself anyway. And I'd tell her that 35 years from now, she'll be sitting on a deck in Colorado, watching mountains that seem to hold up the sky, and she'll feel something close to peace. Not perfect peace, life doesn't offer that. But the kind of peace that comes from knowing you showed up, you did the work, and you gave it everything you had. That, in the end, is enough. Charlie came and laid his head on my knee, and I scratched behind his ears, watching the stars come out one by one over the mountains. Tomorrow, I'd go back to teaching, back to the routines of civilian life that still sometimes felt slightly foreign. But tonight, I just sat with the quiet, with the sense of a story fully told, with gratitude for the complications that had made me who I was. The wind carried the smell of pine and cooling earth. Somewhere in town, a church bell rang the hour. And I sat there on my deck, a retired lieutenant colonel with a dog and a house and a life built from the pieces of service and sacrifice and love that didn't always look like love, but was love nonetheless. My mother had been wrong. God did need soldiers, not for war, but for all the things that come after war. For teaching and mentoring and showing up in uncomfortable truths. For building bridges between worlds that don't naturally understand each other. For being living proof that you can serve something larger than yourself and still be fully, completely human. And maybe, in the end, that was the real revelation. Not that I'd earned my mother's pride through that salute in church, or that I'd finally made peace with our complicated relationship. But that I'd learned to be proud of myself, not in an arrogant way, but in the quiet way of someone who'd done hard things for good reasons and could live with the cost. The stars were fully out now, brilliant against the dark sky. I sat there until the cold drove me inside, until Charlie started nudging me toward the door, until the day had fully ended and it was time to let it go. Inside, I locked up and got ready for bed, moving through the familiar routines. Before turning off the light, I touched the silver cross at my bedside, my mother's cross, worn for decades against her heart, now resting beside mine. Tomorrow I'd put it back on, wear it to class, let it remind me that faith and duty aren't opposites, but partners in the complicated work of living a meaningful life. I turned off the light and settled into bed, Charlie curled up on the floor beside me. And I fell asleep thinking about Sunday services and salutes, about mothers and daughters, about all the ways we serve and are served by the people we love. The story was done. The peace was earned. And tomorrow would bring new students, new questions, new opportunities to pass forward what I'd learned in 30 years of uniform and 10 years out of it. It was enough. I was enough. And finally, after all these years, I believed it. So what do you think? Was my mother wrong to judge my service, or was the priest right to honor it in front of everyone? Would you have stood up in that moment, or walked away in silence like I did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story hit close to home, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever had to earn respect the hard way.